Welcome back, dear friend. I'm so glad you have found us in our quiet corner. I hope the world has been treating you kindly, and that you find peace and rest here. Let us take a long, deep breath together and feel the quiet stillness of the room settle around us. Tonight's story touches on a feeling that is very human, the quiet worry about tomorrow. Sometimes when the wind blows cold and the evenings grow long, a small voice inside us wonders if we have enough, if we are prepared enough, or if the warmth will last through the winter. But as we will see tonight, in the sleeping kitchen of Rosehip Cottage, the future is a vast space that we cannot hoard in jars. The only warmth we ever truly have is the warmth of the present moment, and when we share that warmth, we find that the pot never truly runs empty. So let us tuck the blankets close, let our shoulders drop, and listen to the slow, heavy tick of the grandfather clock as the winter snow begins to fall over the valley. The first true snow of the year arrived in the dales not with a howling storm, but with a silent, breathless drift. By the time the afternoon sun had dipped behind the high western ridge, the valley was wrapped in a thick, insulating blanket of white that muffled every sound. The lanes were completely empty. The dry stone walls were crowned with soft domes of snow, and the forest stood still and dark against a sky the colour of a wild plum. Inside Rosehip Cottage, the kitchen was a sanctuary of golden light and humming warmth. Berry and Carrotina had spent the afternoon sorting through the deep willow storage baskets in the back of the walk-in pantry, preparing for the long cold months ahead. Tucked away in the very back of a low shelf, beneath a collection of dried sage bundles, Berry's paws brushed against something heavy and metallic. He pulled it out into the lantern light. It was an old, long-handled ladle made of thick, hand-hammered pewter. The bowl of the ladle was remarkably wide and deep, showing the soft, silver-grey patina of age, while the handle was beautifully curved to fit the palm of a paw. It was tarnished and dull, but as Carrotina rubbed it gently with a soft cotton cloth, a quiet, reassuring lustre began to show through the grey. "What a beautiful old thing," Carrotina said, her voice slow and peaceful in the quiet room. "Let us use it tonight for the harvest broth." Rosco had spent the morning preparing a simple rustic soup in the great black iron pot on top of the stove. It was a humble recipe made from the cellar's deep winter stores. Sweet, woody parsnips chopped into thick rounds, roasted chestnuts that had been peeled and crushed, wild forest mushrooms dried during the late summer rains, and a handful of yellow split peas to thicken the broth. The mixture had been simmering for hours over a low, lazy ember, filling every corner of the kitchen with a rich, savoury steam that carried the scent of earth, sweet grain, and total contentment. As the twilight deepened, the heavy iron gate at the lane clicked open. 3 small, weary neighbours, 2 field mice from the hedgerow, and a sleepy grey squirrel from the old oak, had knocked on the door to escape the bitter frost of the lanes. Rosco had welcomed them in, guiding them to the braided rug by the stove, where they could thaw their stiff paws. "Sit down, do," Rosco said. "We have just enough broth to take the chill out of your bones." Berry lifted the old pewter ladle, dipping it into the iron pot. He expected the ladle to scrape the bottom quickly, for the pot was small and their guests were hungry. But as he lifted the first scoop, he noticed something extraordinary. The ladle felt incredibly light in his paw, almost as if it were lifting itself. He poured a rich, steaming mound of thick chestnut broth into the first earthenware bowl. He dipped it again, and again, and again. He filled the bowls for the mice, the squirrel, Carrotina, Rosco, and himself. Yet when he looked back into the iron pot, the level of the soup had not dropped by even a single inch. It was as though the pot were a deep, hidden well of warmth. The old ladle seemed to find a perfect, hot portion for every single bowl presented, leaving everyone sitting in a cosy circle, their hands wrapped around the warm stoneware, cradled in absolute safety and abundance. By the next morning, word of the miraculous endless soup had drifted quietly through the snowy woods, eventually reaching the ears of Snickety Haggle. Snickety Haggle lived on the very edge of the parish woods in a deep, draughty burrow beneath an old elderberry root. He was a long, slender weasel with a coat of pale cinnamon fur, a pair of quick, anxious black eyes, and a heart that was constantly in a flutter of worry. Snickety was not a bad sort, but his mind was like a spinning top that could never find a quiet place to rest. He spent his days counting his dried acorns, measuring his kindling stacks, and worrying that the winter would be too long, too cold, and too hungry. When he heard the rumours of a ladle that could produce endless hot soup from a tiny pot, his chest tightened with a desperate, anxious longing. "If I had that soup," Snickety whispered to himself, his paws trembling as he looked around his cold, dark burrow. "If I had that soup stored away in my cellar, I would never have to worry about the frost again. I could sleep through the winter like the badgers do." He waited until the middle of the night, when the moon was a high, cold sliver of silver, casting long blue shadows across the deep snow. Slipping out of his burrow, he dragged 2 massive empty glass storage jars behind him on a small wooden sledge. His paws were numb and his breath rose in sharp, ragged puffs of white as he crept down the silent lane toward Rosehip Cottage. The farmhouse was completely dark, its windows frosted with beautiful fern-like patterns that kept the cold night out. Snickety slipped through the small latch window in the pantry, his long, slender body moving without a sound. He stepped into the kitchen. The only light came from the pale blue moonbeams sleeping on the clean pine floor. The great black stove was silent, holding only a deep, protective crimson ember inside its iron belly. On the counter, resting beside the empty iron pot, lay the tarnished pewter ladle. Snickety's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped sparrow. He lifted one of his huge, cold glass jars and set it on the table. With trembling paws, he grabbed the pewter ladle, lifted the heavy iron lid of the pot, and dipped the spoon into the dark, fragrant broth. He pulled the ladle up. It felt strangely heavy in his paw, like a stone weight. He carefully tilted the bowl of the spoon over the wide mouth of his giant glass jar, expecting to see the thick, rich parsnip and chestnut soup pour in. But as the liquid fell, a soft, hollow splash echoed through the dark kitchen. Snickety blinked, leaning closer in the moonlight. The jar was not filled with steaming, fragrant broth. It was filled with thin, perfectly clear, ice-cold well water. He dipped the ladle again, his movements frantic and rushed. He scooped from the very bottom of the pot, but every time the pewter spoon lifted, the rich soup seemed to vanish from its bowl, replaced by nothing but the clear, cold water of the deep earth. Frustrated and confused from the damp chill of his own anxiety, Snickety Haggle lowered the lid of the pot. He pulled his heavy glass jars back out into the freezing night, his mind spinning with a deeper, more desperate worry than before. The next day, a heavy, quiet mist settled over the valley, clinging to the tops of the snow-laden pine trees and dampening the sound of the creek. Snickety Haggle spent the entire day pacing the floor of his draughty burrow, his long tail twitching with a restless, anxious energy. He counted his winter kindling 3 separate times, but the neat stacks of birch logs brought him no peace. His mind remained locked on the image of the old pewter ladle and the steaming, fragrant parsnip broth that never ran dry. "It must have been the glass," Snickety muttered to himself, his paws turning over a large, empty clay jug that sat in the corner of his cellar. "Glass is cold. It has no heart. The ladle must have seen the moonlight shining through the glass and turned the soup to water. A clay jug is different. Clay comes from the earth. It is warm and thick." He waited again for the deep, silent hours of midnight, when the rest of the valley had tucked itself beneath its heavy blankets. The snow outside was frozen solid, forming a hard, glittering crust that crackled softly under his light steps. Dragging the heavy clay jug on his little wooden sledge, Snickety Haggle made his way back down the quiet, misty lane toward Rosehip Cottage. The cottage was as still as a stone. Inside the kitchen, the only sound was the slow, patient tick of the tall grandfather clock in the corner, measuring out the quiet hours of the winter night. The great black stove held its steady, protective heat, radiating a faint, comforting warmth that smelled of old brick and seasoned ashwood. Snickety slipped inside, his long, slender body gliding across the flagstones like a shadow. He lifted the heavy clay jug onto the pine table, his breath coming in short, anxious gasps. His paws were stiff from the biting cold outside, and his heart was racing with a desperate need to secure his winter store. He reached for the pewter ladle, its tarnished handle feeling remarkably cold and heavy in his hand. He lifted the lid of the iron pot, revealing the dark, rich broth resting quietly over the dying embers. With a trembling arm, he dipped the ladle deep into the soup and lifted it toward the mouth of the clay jug. But as the liquid poured from the pewter bowl, it made a sharp, clear splashing sound that carried no warmth. Snickety leaned over the jar, his nose working rapidly. There was no scent of roasted chestnuts, no sweet aroma of parsnips, and no rich, savoury steam. The jug was filled to the brim with nothing but clear, motionless, freezing well water. He tried again, stirring the pot with a rushed, frantic rhythm that made the ladle clink sharply against the iron pot. But no matter how deep he scooped, or how quickly he poured, the ladle refused to yield even a single drop of the harvest soup. It was though the magic of the ladle was completely closed to him, locked away behind an invisible wall that his anxiety could not penetrate. Exhausted and cold, and with his mind spinning in a dark web of worry, Snickety Haggle lowered the lid of the pot. He dragged his heavy, water-filled clay jug back out into the freezing mist, his limbs feeling leaden, and his heart heavier than it had ever been. On the third night, a biting north wind swept down from the high ridges, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees and sending fine, powdery snow dancing across the lane. Snickety Haggle had not slept for 3 nights. His eyes were wide and shadowed with fatigue. His cinnamon fur was damp and dishevelled, and a deep, shivering chill had settled into his bones that no amount of blankets could seem to thaw. Driven by a sheer, desperate exhaustion, he crept back to Rosehip Cottage for one last, hopeless attempt. He didn't even bring his wooden sledge this time. He simply carried a single stoneware crock in his trembling arms, his muscles aching under the weight. He slipped through the pantry window, nearly stumbling as his feet touched the kitchen floor. The room was completely dark, save for the faint, warm crimson glow of the stove's draught gate, which painted long, sleepy shadows across the pine floorboards. The grandfather clock continued its slow, unhurried lullaby, welcoming him into its quiet, unchanging space. Snickety Haggle set the heavy stoneware crock on the table with a soft thud. His paws were so cold he could barely feel the handle of the pewter ladle as he lifted it from the counter. With a quiet, ragged sigh, he opened the iron pot and dipped the ladle one more time. He pulled it up, his eyes straining in the dim crimson light. He poured. Once again, the cold, clear sound of pure water splashing into the bottom of the crock echoed through the silent kitchen. Snickety Haggle's strength completely failed him. He let the ladle drop onto the table with a dull clunk, and his slender shoulders slumped forward. He leaned his forehead against the cold stoneware crock, his paws cradling his ears, as a single quiet tear of utter frustration and exhaustion slipped down his nose. He felt so incredibly small, so cold, and so completely alone in the face of the long, dark winter. "It's no use," he whispered into the dark, his voice a tiny trembling thread. "The winter is too big, and I am too small. The warmth is only for the bunnies, and there is nothing left for me." From the deep velvet shadows of the kitchen corner, a low, slow, comforting sound broke the silence. It was the gentle, familiar creak of the high-backed wicker armchair. Snickety Haggle stiffened, his breath catching in his throat as a soft shadow detached itself from the darkness near the hearth. A warm hand was gently laid upon the stove's iron rail, and the soft tread of wool-socked feet moved across the floor. It was Rosco. He had not been asleep at all. He had been sitting quietly in his chair, watching the anxious little weasel throughout the long, silent night. Snickety Haggle squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for the scolding he was sure he was going to have. He braced for anger, for the sharp click of the kitchen door opening to cast him back out into the biting north wind. But no such anger came. Instead, the soft shuffle of Rosco's wool-socked feet came to a stop right beside the pine table. With an unhurried, gentle movement, Rosco reached out a downy paw and picked up the tarnished pewter ladle from the table. He did not look at the heavy, empty stoneware crock with judgment. Instead, he reached up to the high wooden shelf above the stove and pulled down a single, small ceramic bowl. A bowl that was painted with a simple, cheerful pattern of yellow buttercups. Rosco dipped the pewter ladle deep into the iron pot. To Snickety Haggle's utter amazement, the ladle did not scrape or splash with the sound of cold water. When Rosco lifted the ladle, it was filled to the very brim with a rich, steaming, thick mound of parsnip and chestnut broth. A beautiful golden red wave of savoury steam rose into the air, carrying the rich aroma of roasted mushrooms and sweet, simmering herbs. Rosco poured the steaming soup into the buttercup bowl. Then he gently slid the warm ceramic dish across the pine table, right into the path of Snickety's shivering paws. "Your hands are very cold, Snickety," Rosco said, "and your mind has been running a very long way tonight. Sit. Eat while the steam is still rising." Snickety stared at the warm bowl, his nose twitching rapidly as the fragrant steam began to thaw the tip of his nose. But the water," he stammered, looking at his large, empty stoneware crock. "Every time I tried to fill my jars, it turned to ice-cold water. I thought the ladle was angry with me." Rosco let out a soft, warm chuckle a sound like dry autumn leaves rustling in a gentle breeze. He pulled up a sturdy wooden stool, sitting down beside the trembling weasel with an air of unhurried patience. "The ladle is not angry," Rosco said, his dark eyes reflecting the soft red glow of the stove's embers. "But this ladle holds a very ancient, gentle piece of valley magic. It knows that large jars and heavy crocks belong to tomorrow, and tomorrow is a place that does not exist yet. The magic cannot feed your fear of the future. It cannot fill a jar that you are trying to hoard out of worry." Rosco gently nudged the small buttercup bowl a little closer to the weasel. "But a bowl belongs entirely to tonight. It is small enough to hold in your paws, and it is meant to be enjoyed right now, in the safety of this kitchen. The ladle knows that we cannot store up warmth for the coming months, but it also knows that when we take only what we need for this very moment, there is always enough to go around." Snickety Haggle looked down at the steaming broth. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted the small spoon. He took a slow, deliberate sip. The warmth of the parsnip broth was instantaneous, spreading down his throat, radiating out to his cold fingertips, and right down into his tumblington. It felt like a physical weight of comfort, melting the tight, icy knot of anxiety that had been gripping his chest for 3 long days. He took another sip, and then another, letting the rich, savoury flavours wash over him. For the first time in weeks, his mind stopped spinning. He didn't think about his wood piles. He didn't worry about the winter snow. And he didn't count his acorns. He was simply here, in the quiet kitchen, wrapped in warmth. By the time Snickety had finished the very last drop of the warm parsnip broth, his eyelids had grown incredibly heavy. The shivering in his limbs had completely vanished, replaced by a delicious leaden relaxation that made him want to do nothing but curl up and let the world drift away. "You don't have to carry those heavy jars back through the snow tonight, Snickety," Rosco said softly. "Leave them by the door. Go home to your burrow, crawl beneath your blankets and rest. The valley will not forget you this winter. Whenever you are hungry, there will always be a bowl waiting for you here." Snickety nodded, his long ears drooping in absolute sleepy gratitude. He slipped out of the cottage door into the quiet winter night. The north wind was still blowing, but it no longer felt hostile or frightening. The snow-covered lanes looked peaceful, like a soft white down comforter laid over the earth. When he reached his burrow, he crawled deep into his nest of dry leaves, pulled his blankets up to his chinnigan, and fell into the deepest, most peaceful sleep he had ever known. Back inside Rosehip Cottage, the kitchen returned to its silent, sacred nocturnal rhythm. The grandfather clock in the corner kept up its faithful, soothing song, marking the peaceful passage of the night. Berry and Carrotina, who had watched the final moments from the top of the stairs, crept back down to the hearth. They wrapped their plush, heather-purple blankets tightly around their shoulders, sinking into their deep, high-backed armchairs. The great black stove glowed with a soft, protective crimson ember, keeping the frost far away from their sanctuary. They closed their eyes, letting their minds empty of worry, of jars and of tomorrow. The ladle was resting quietly on the counter, its silver-grey pewter catching the soft light, and the entire valley was safe. As you let your own eyes close now, and you sink deeper into the absolute comfort and support of your own bed, let these gentle thoughts wrap around your mind. My day is beautifully complete, and there is nothing left to do. My hands are perfectly still, and my thoughts are slowing down. I am surrounded by warmth, safety, and deep, quiet comfort. I give myself full permission to let go of the world outside. I am perfectly protected, and everything is taken care of. I am ready to drift into a deep, beautiful and restful sleep. Let the slow, lazy pulse of the night carry you deeper and deeper into the quiet dark. The lane is quiet. The soup is resting. The little weasel is fast asleep. And you are entirely safe. All was snug. All was well. Night-night.